You've seen the leaks, you've read the rumors, you've watched some limited video coverage from CES, and then the other day you may have also suffered through my awkward unboxing of the brand new high-end graphics card from AMD, the Radeon VII. I've had this card for about a week now, and what a week it has been, full of benchmarks, research, fact-checking, retesting, measuring, charting, and scripting this very review that you're about to watch. This might actually be the most thorough, in-depth graphics card review I've ever put together for the channel, so hopefully if you're curious about this card, I'll have the answers for you coming up. We have a lot of data to go through today, and instead of just throwing a bunch of charts at the screen and giving you all of 5 seconds to digest the data before it scrolls away, I want to talk about what the data points mean and why you might actually care. If you just want to skip to the charts, I get it, and you can go to this timestamp if you're in a rush. But I'd advise you to sit through the talky bits if you can. There's a lot of info coming your way. You see, major AMD releases from the graphics team are few and far between, whereas there seems to be a new NVIDIA product launched, I don't know, every few months at this point as they space out their 50, 60, 70, 80, and Titan series, not to mention TI SKUs. The last Vega card we saw was in 2017, and basically every other product from AMD since 2016 has been some version of an RX 480. So this caught a lot of people's attention when it was formally announced almost exactly a month ago today. Radeon 7 may not be completely new from the ground up, but it's certainly close enough that its launch carries some serious heft. Yes, the Vega 20 die is still based on the GCN architecture first seen in Polaris, but the move to the 7nm process node in and of itself is noteworthy on a consumer product, and AMD should be commended for being the first ones to walk out onto that ledge without a safety net. Because of the massive reduction in die size, this left a gaping hole on the package that AMD crammed full of second generation high bandwidth memory, or HBM2. Comparing Vega 64 to Radeon 7, we can see 2 extra stacks of HBM totaling out to 16 gigabytes. Again, a first for a consumer GPU. The recent Titan RTX was released with 24 gigabytes of memory, although A, it's GDDR6, not HBM, and B, the Titan RTX cost $2,500, not really a direct competitor to the $700 Radeon 7. The main target for Radeon 7 is actually the first NVIDIA Turing card to market, the RTX 2080. And you can see what a massive advantage the Radeon 7 has here in memory bandwidth due to this configuration and the 4096-bit memory interface. It also smokes the Vega 64 and even the Vega Frontier Edition. It should be noted that if the spec sheet of the Radeon 7 looks at least mildly familiar to you, that's because it's almost identical to the Radeon Instinct MI60, a GPU compute card designed for deep learning and AI functions and not in any way a gaming product. In fact, it has no display outputs and is made to be slapped into a data center machine, never to have played even a single game of PUBG. In speaking with the AMD graphics team at CES, I asked them point blank what exactly made them try gaming on Vega 20. And they just said that they had a feeling that it would be a high-performing chip, so they used a slightly cut-down version going from 64 compute units to 60, bolted on some display outputs and a better heatsink and fan design, and here we are today. Now, speaking of that cooler, I am simultaneously impressed and horrified with what AMD has been able to do here. I am actually excited that both AMD and NVIDIA have seemed to come to the conclusion that blower coolers really actually blow. And with high performance, high power consumption products, they were actually gimping their own performance by equipping them with impractical, loud, ineffective coolers. Now we get this, which basically feels like they took a solid brick of aluminum and carved out enough space inside for a PCB, because not only is it quite substantial feeling, but it's industrial looking to the extreme and has some serious squared off corners. Additionally, the fan blades they've equipped this thing with are, and this is not hyperbole, razor sharp. If I was a ninja, I would detach these things and use them as throwing stars, because holy hell did I absolutely destroy my finger by accident by touching one of the blades while it was spinning. That was kind of a stupid move. But seriously, be careful when handling the Radeon VII, or maybe just don't be an idiot like me. Those blades, though, might be shaped like that for a reason, because as far as cooling performance, this thing is cool as a cucumber outside in Chicago winter. Compared to Vega 64 and Vega Frontier, Radeon VII is hugely effective at staying well below thermal limits, and it's even better than the 2080 FE. The 2070 that I tested was the EVGA XC Ultra model with a super thick 3-slot heatsink, and it's also a lower power card, so I'd expect it to be the best of the bunch, and in fact it is. But having 3 relatively small fans does come at a cost, and that cost will be noticed almost immediately by your ears. Out of our 5-card test suite, Radeon VII was by far the loudest at load, with my trusty sound meter measuring a constant 55 decibels. This was even worse than the 2 blower cards, as Vega 64 was only about 50 decibels. Not only that, but my test sample exhibited quite a bit of coil whine during high frame rate scenes, especially loading animations or menu screens. Coil whine usually does vary a bit from card to card though, so your retail product might not have any at all, and I would hope that that's the case. What does this much improved cooling solution get us? Well, for one, much more stable clocks. When I fired up Vega 64 to run my benchmarks, the average clock speed settled at 1413 MHz, a full 133 MHz lower than the rated boost clock. While Radeon VII didn't manage to maintain its rated speed of 1800, it came fairly close, settling in at 1752 after about a half-hour soak. This does lead to an interesting discussion though. If we look at the 2 NVIDIA cards here, you'll note that the actual performance of the 2080 and the 2070 exceeds what NVIDIA puts on the box. This has been true for many generations now, and in fact, I'm sure if NVIDIA released a card tomorrow that only ran at its rated clock speed and didn't boost higher, people would riot in the streets. It's just kind of what we've come to expect from them, that they rate a card for a certain speed, and we know that when we're gaming, we'll see 100 or 125 megahertz more than that. AMD, on the other hand, goes in the opposite direction. Whatever they say a card will boost to, you can expect it to really settle at a steady state, much lower. And again, this goes back several generations. In business, the old adage, under-promise and over-deliver, rings so true that it would behoove AMD to rethink their marketing strategy here for Navi. Promise a lower clock speed, and people will be pleasantly surprised when your card goes faster than that. As it is now, whenever I test an AMD card, I'm almost always disappointed that I can't get it to run as fast as AMD said that it would. I did also run into some other issues while testing Radeon VII. I'm sure that at least some of these had to do with running on the press driver provided by AMD. The final build should be much more polished and hopefully fix some of these problems. First off, I B-sodded way too often, like 3 or 4 times during the few days I was benching this card. This is unusual and didn't happen once with any of the other 4 cards. Second, I had occasional Wattman crashes, which, as it turns out, is actually the only monitoring utility that worked properly, so I had to use it. I'll be blunt, I don't like Wattman, but I use it when I have to, and for the most part, it has been stable. Well, not with Radeon VII it hasn't. Since MSI Afterburner, Sapphire Tricks, and even GPU-Z were throwing up the old question mark because this thing is just so new, I had to use Wattman for temps, clock speeds, memory, etc. For this reason, I'm going to save overclocking for another video when I have access to proper tools like Afterburner and a better driver, because overclocking in Wattman is trash. I tried it twice with Radeon VII. One time it crashed instantly, and the second time it didn't seem to do anything no matter what I did. The resulting clock speed wasn't changing at all, and the memory was staying the same, so I don't really know what was happening there. This brings us to the actual benchmarking suite and results. First off, the test bench and competing cards. All tests were run on my 9900K test bench at 5 GHz and with XMP on. The motherboard is a Z390RS Master and uses 16 gigs of Corsair Vengeance LPX DDR4 3200. The CPU cooler is the Corsair H150i Pro, and the power supply is by Cooler Master, the V850. Storage is a Western Digital Blue SSD. For today's comparison, I ran the Radeon VII against Vega 64 and Vega Frontier. The reason being that the Frontier Edition card was marketed as a workstation card and had 16 gigs of HBM2 as well, even if clock speeds were significantly lower. I also ran an RTX 2080 Fe and a 2070 XC Ultra from EVGA. As AMD is marketing Radeon VII as not only a powerful gaming graphics card, but also a content creation and GPU compute workhorse, I figured that it was fair to not only test it in games, but also in compute tasks. There were 8 total GPU compute benchmarks. Let's take a look at them in groups. The first group is where it didn't really matter which GPU I used, the results were about the same. In Adobe Premiere, I exported a full 11-minute 4K timeline, actually my Corsair keyboard video from 2 weeks ago. And then in Davinci Resolve, I exported a single 3-minute 4K video file, but with heavy grading applied. All 5 GPUs scored about the same in both tests. The second group is where Radeon VII really shined. The Blender BMW render test in GPU compute mode really showed a small but measurable margin of victory over all others, and in Luxmark, the Radeon VII just smashed everyone handily. The Davinci Resolve standard candle test was also interesting. This test involves looping a single short video file with 66 different nodes applied, including grading and transitions. As almost all of the load is being handled by the GPU, it's a great measure of GPU compute, and the Radeon VII comes out ahead once again. This is true to what AMD was hyping this card as, good for content creators, but then again, is it actually? Because there were 3 tests where it lost fairly handily, and one of them was actually an example that AMD had boasted about before. This is how Adobe Premiere handles 8K red footage with grading and transitions, and both NVIDIA cards beat out the AMD products. I configured this test by taking 2 separate red 8K video files, cutting them up in Premiere, and smashing them and layering them together with random transitions and applying color grading to all clips. I guess this does show the power of CUDA acceleration. The other 2 tests also go for the 2080 over the Radeon VII, with Geekbench being a blowout and SpecView Perf 3ds Max not being particularly close either. I will note, however, that AMD's claims of significant increased performance over the Vega 64 were not false. These almost hold true universally across the board. But let's move over to gaming, because AMD is positioning this card to compete directly against the RTX 2080 at $700 US. They also showed several examples of Radeon VII beating the 2080 in gaming at CES. So do those claims hold water? Well, yes, actually, but unfortunately that's only for 3 of our 13 total gaming benchmarks. In Deus Ex Mankind Divided, Doom, and Strange Brigade, the Radeon VII was the clear winner. I would note that Deus Ex using DirectX 12 was very close, and the other 2 titles run on the Vulkan API, which is a traditional AMD stronghold. I would imagine that these results could carry over to any other game that uses Vulkan, like Wolfenstein. In 2 other titles, Radeon VII was within spitting distance of the 2080, and I'd basically call these kind of a toss-up. These include Far Cry 5 and Firestrike Extreme, and depending on which individual test run I was on, either card could come out on top. The final numbers that you see, however, are an average of 3 runs. The last group, though, brings some not so great news for AMD fanboys, and that's 8 games where the Radeon VII got its butt whooped. Overall, I try to vary my testing titles as much as possible, including DX11, DX12, and Vulkan, new titles, old titles, and mainstays like Time Spy. For Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Ashes of the Singularity, The Division, For Honor, Unigine Heaven, Metro Last Light, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and 3D Mark Time Spy, the RTX 2080 was the clear winner. Just to check off another box, I also ran the Radeon VII through several titles at 4K, basically all with settings maxed out, just like they were at 1440p. If you happen to play Vulkan titles again, you're probably golden here. Otherwise, you might have a satisfactory experience with some games, but suffer in others. Overall, it's probably not the best choice for single card 4K. However, with some quality settings, you could probably make it work if you really wanted to, but I don't think 4K is really the target here. So where does that leave us when evaluating Radeon 7? Kind of in a weird spot, actually. As I discussed on a live stream last week, I'm not on a team. I'm not Team Green for NVIDIA, I'm not Team Red for AMD, and I'm not Team Blue for Intel. I'm Team give me the best performance, I don't care who you are. And that means that I have to evaluate performance of the equipment that I use at each price tier regardless of who is actually making it. If we're looking at spending $700 or $700-ish on a graphics card now in early 2019, we have two choices. You can either get an RTX 2080, and depending on the version that you choose, maybe you're spending a little bit more. Or you can pick up the new Radeon 7. I find myself hard-pressed to recommend the AMD card in most use cases, but I'd encourage you to figure out what you want to do with this $700 purchase before you make it. Are you going to be working with heavily graded footage in Davinci Resolve, or rendering out scenes in Blender? Will you be playing a lot of games that use the Vulkan API? Maybe the Radeon 7 is actually for you. But for basically everybody else, the RTX 2080 makes more sense. And here's why. In the past, a lot of GPU purchase decisions have been driven by a desire to use variable refresh rate monitors. And I could get behind the logic of purchasing a Vega 64 over a GTX 1080 so that you can take advantage of the plentiful FreeSync monitor support and not have to worry about ponying up the extra $200 or so for a comparable G-Sync panel. But now that NVIDIA decided to write FreeSync support into their drivers, the RTX lineup of cards now works with both FreeSync and with G-Sync, giving them a leg up on AMD, which works only with FreeSync still. So you have two cards here. Both are the same price, or thereabouts. They're close enough that we can directly compare them. So dollar-wise, it's a wash. If we look at overall performance, I ran 21 total benchmarks, and Radeon 7 won 5 of them. 5 out of 21. A few were ties, but most went to the 2080, even in the compute category where Vega 20 is supposed to be a monster. And now, adaptive sync support is also better on Turing, because you can use both NVIDIA's proprietary technology or AMD's open source version, whereas Radeon 7 can only use one of those. Not to even mention the fact that the 2080 can do all kinds of ray tracing shenanigans whenever that technology and software matures to the point of being useful. Slightly helping to offset the cost here is the inclusion of 3 AAA titles with the purchase of a Radeon 7 card. That's Resident Evil 2, Devil May Cry 5, and The Division 2. That's a legit $180 worth of software, and if you intend on buying those games anyway, maybe that's enough to sway your decision. If you factor in the cost of those games, getting the Radeon 7 for $520 is, without a doubt, the best graphics card deal on the market today. But until that's the actual cost outlay for someone shopping on Newegg, I don't know if you're going to see this be a popular product. I'd actually say that if this was released at $599 instead of $699, this review would have been completely different in tone. And I'd be gung-ho recommending that you go out and buy one. Maybe we'll see a price cut. Hopefully, AMD, if you're listening. And lastly, here is our hypothetical vacuum chamber talk. If Radeon 7 existed in a vacuum, is it a bad product? No, definitely not. It's a very strong 1440p performer with some actual 4K gaming chops in select titles. It does GPU compute workloads admirably, and it cools itself like a champ. A very noisy champ, but a champ nonetheless. It straight out dumps on previous generation Vega hardware and all the AMD Polaris cards. And if worse comes to worse, you can always slice tomatoes paper thin with the fan blades. But as with everything we talk about on this channel, products don't exist in a vacuum. And you as an educated consumer should not be brand loyal at the detriment of performance when better products exist. I will say this though, I'm sure AMD can fix a lot of things with better and more mature drivers, and I hope that they do. It would be fun to see this thing go toe-to-toe with the 2080, and I'd definitely be open to doing a full retest if that ever came to fruition. AMD, make it happen, because despite how it may seem, I am rooting for you, and so is everyone else. Thanks for watching this supersize and extra long review, and thanks for making it this far. Get subscribed if you're not already, and as always, guys, I will see you next time.